Okay, welcome everybody to the session that I'm informally calling "What the heck is going on with Way?" If you haven't heard the news, this is a session with Judy Brewer, the still director of the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative, and there was an announcement that she is leaving Way. So this session is going to be about the next steps and the future of the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative. Just to give a little bit of a background, I've known these two amazing people for over 20 years now. I've worked with them for 18 years before moving on. I don't work with W3C anymore since over a year now. I work with Amazon at a job that I absolutely love. And I would like to introduce, many of you will know Judy Brewer, the director of the Web Accessibility Initiative, who's led Way for over 25 years now. I think that really deserves a bit of a round of applause. Her leadership in the field has been absolutely tremendous and I think really important to accessibility overall. But, you know, it takes a village. Actually, it takes literally an entire community to create accessibility standards and accessibility guidelines. The community is the accessibility community that comes together to work on developing these standards. But it takes Michael Cooper to actually make sure that these standards get technically put together, that they're technically sound, and that they get published. After so many years, I may say my friend, Michael Cooper, and my former colleague, who is Senior Web Accessibility Specialist, the current title, to my right, and has been an incredible factor at the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative. So today's session, I want to dig in a little bit more, get to know these people. Judy, who's leaving, I think one of the biggest questions that people were asking me is, where is she going? But also reflect a bit on Michael and learn about what's happening, what are the plans, the transitions plans in the coming years. So when Way announced that Judy is leaving, I got a phone call pretty immediately from somebody who was really excited and said, what's happening there? Can you imagine Way without Judy? And I thought to myself and I said, actually, it's hard to imagine Judy without Way. So Judy, the most important question maybe is, how are you?
How am I? So, thanks, Judy. Thank you for agreeing on very short notice to interview Michael and me so that we could explain the transition that's happening.
My former boss.
And I'll also thank you to Axel Lebois for putting something in the program to give us this opportunity to reassure the community that that Way is continuing, and I feel in very, very good hands. I wouldn't be leaving to take another opportunity if I didn't feel that the Way team, the staff, and the Way community are incredibly strong and vibrant beyond my wildest dreams when we started this. But sorry, you were asking, Shadi, what I'm, how am I, and maybe also where I'm going, or where? No,
it's open to interpretation.
It's open to interpretation. Yeah. So I'm doing great, thanks. It's been a tough stretch, I think, for everybody during the pandemic, and for me, as I was approaching my 25-year anniversary, I still can't quite believe that with W3C. I started to think about things that I've been observing and feeling like we've accomplished a lot in Way. There's a lot more we need to do. I feel like it's time for other people to try their hand at that. And for myself, my attention has been turning more and more to other kinds of questions, such as when I look across the world, when I look at my own country, I haven't been looking at my own country so much over the past 25 years in an international organization. I feel like there's so many times when people with disabilities could be benefiting from technology so much more than we have access to. And there are barriers to getting technology or even keeping technology that people with disabilities have. There's a lot of underutilization of advanced technology. And some of that is in the government sector. I think some of that needs to change. So I'm joining the Partnership for Public Service, which, if people aren't familiar with that, it does a lot of training of senior government officials. There's a lot of interest in increasing the dialogue within that community on how science and technology can benefit people with disabilities. And they may loan me around to different places potentially. So I'll let you know where I land if I land somewhere else. But I'm very happy to be starting to work with part-time with the Partnership for Public Service. I'm continuing with W3C part-time as well for the next several months to help with the transition. I think I've kind of jumped around and answered different parts of questions, but back to you, Shadi.
That's totally fine. That's totally fine. You're just checking off all the questions I've written. But so in these 25 years, Judy, there's been a lot of developments. You reflected some of that, some on the community that meanwhile exists. But just generally also, what are the highlights that you've seen over the 25 years? What do you feel are some of the,
I think it's been a surprise from the beginning. When I was invited to start at the Web Accessibility Initiative, I think somebody told me, well, you'll need to make sure that HTML and CSS, cascading style sheets, and SVG, scalable vector graphics, are fixed. So can you please take care of those? I was like, okay, And in about 3 years later, which was the time we were initially given to fix that and go away, W3C had somehow started having, I don't know, like 20 to 30 different technical standards. And now it's hundreds and hundreds of different technical standards. And so one of the things that I've been excited by is the amount of opportunities in digital accessibility, including in the W3C standards environment, which might even sound boring, but I've never had a boring day once since I started at W3C. There is so much to do to make sure that a new technical standard isn't introducing barriers for people with some kind of disability, and also to leverage the possibilities. Like if you get real-time communication, you can have more accessible emergency notifications for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. It's like if you have virtual reality, you can make it accessible in this ways for somebody with a cognitive disability or a visual disability. So I feel like in terms of accomplishments, the field has broadened the dialogue to get inside the technologies as they're being built and try to make sure they work for people with disabilities. And one other thing is the guidelines work, which I trust you're going to ask Michael more about. I've been involved in it, but he's been a lot more involved in it. This has been taken up by many governments around the world, and I think that that's something we didn't expect at the beginning there to be so much appetite and so much need for this and to be taken up. And I'm looking at my friend Irene in the back of the room, who's making sure that Kenya is working on it and some of the surrounding countries there. And thank you for the work you're doing. But this is so important that a common solution to accessibility is being taken up. And so, yeah, it's an accomplishment, but it's been a wonderful surprise.
So I'm going to ask the question to Michael more broadly, because I know that Michael works much more than on guidelines, or has worked in the last years on much more than guidelines. Speaking of building in accessibility features in the core technologies, ARIA, PF, all the history, APA now, but PF in the past. Michael, tell us more about the work you've done over the past, 20 years at WAY?
Well, it's something like 17 or 18 years at WAY, and over 20 years in the field of accessibility. And some of you remember me from back in the days of Bobby when I was doing automated web accessibility checking. From that, I moved on into testing guidelines, and that's how I got connected to W3C, and then went into WCAG. And when Wendy stepped back from being staff contact in 2006, I was in the right position to step in and help finish WCAG 2.0, which came out in 2008. Then I also got involved in the development of the ARIA technology, the Accessible Rich Internet Applications technology. I don't even remember when we came out with that. That was a couple more years after that. That was the group that at the time was the Protocols and Formats Working Group, which split to become the ARIA Working Group and the Accessible Platform Architectures, which reviews all these technologies that Judy was talking about. We check every W3C publication for implications for accessibility and problems for accessibility. When possible, we participate in the development of requirements, et cetera, to help make sure that all the W3C specifications are addressing accessibility. That is always an ongoing effort, but there's a lot, things are a lot better than they would be if we weren't doing that. We've also been publishing user requirements documents that really explain to people what accessibility means in a very specific context. And all of this work on guidelines, technical specifications, and accessibility user requirements is what I think is helping me to be able to step into some of Judy's role. I've had a lot of experience with the process of getting work through W3C's process, working with working group participants who are struggling with the process, producing deliverables, and I have a very broad technical vision that I think I can try to help bring forward in the next stages of WAY as we sort ourselves out through new staffing and et cetera.
Absolutely, and you're stepping ahead a bit, but I was going to go exactly now next about this transition. We are in a time right now where W3C is undergoing a major restructuring. For those who don't know, and maybe Judy, you can say a bit more about that. W3C going from the current model of 4 hosts, basically an agreement between them, to an incorporated nonprofit or a nonprofit organization, a registered nonprofit, because organization. And so there's a lot of changes, and at this time, there's also that major change at WAY. So what are the transition steps that are being planned here, and what are the next steps in terms of just personnel?
So, thanks, Shadi. This is indeed a time of change for W3C as well. And so that's something that has given me pause in terms of making my own transition at this time. And I wanted to be very clear, I'm making the transition for my personal reasons after all these years. My attention had shifted, and I have a lot of faith in WAY and in W3C, and a lot of confidence in what's happening there. And something came along, and so the timing is really my own reasons. But just to explain a little bit more about what Shadi has mentioned, for the entire time we've been, Michael and I, and previously Shadi, you, have been at the W3C, it's actually an agreement between 4 different hosts on different continents. And so for years, we've wanted to move to a single legal entity, essentially so we could work more efficiently as a more centralized organization. So this is a very important transition. And this is something that I've also been trying to help with, because the transition has accelerated over the past year. And it will be happening to some extent in stages. The host that Michael and I are both based at, which is MIT, W3C will be moving out of MIT at the end of December. And then the host in Europe, ERCIM, the host in Japan, the host in China. Those will be doing their transitions, some on their own time. But the idea is to reconsolidate the organization. There is actually a new board of directors that had its it was seated last Thursday, and I see this as a good change for W3C moving forward, for there to be some consolidation. I expect the organization will change in some ways, but I have good confidence in the people who are in the new board of directors, the continuing advisory board, the W3C management, that who all have in mind the stewardship of the standards body for the web. The W3C advisory committee, which is made up of all the member representatives of member organizations. And I think this is an important combination. The WAY community, the web accessibility community, is also a very important piece of that. So one of the things I've been working on is trying to make sure that WAY is well understood in the new organization, and I'm sure that Michael will be helping in that communication transition as well. So does that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I indeed will, I see it as very important that the WAY continue to exist as an identifiable organization. You know, we have consolidated expertise in web accessibility that although we do try to encourage other people to learn the area, they don't have the expertise that we have. So the transition that W3C is going through is effectively going to be completed at the start of the new year. The new board that was just elected is officially in power in the new year, and so the management of the organization is sorting through, you know, what is their structure going to be, and they are not looking at what is our structure going to be. So for the next few months, this is our opportunity to think through what do we need. You know, we won't have the additional staffing. Judy will be gone, but we will have me, and then we'll have Kevin White, who has a lot of project management and team management experience. We'll have Sean Henry, Roy Ron, Daniel Montalvo. They all have experience in different aspects of the WAY work. We will be discussing what are our strengths and what are we missing from the picture in the WAY staffing. So I'm hoping in the early part of the new year that we'll have a vision for that, you know, what a new staff role should look like and what each of our roles will be, including my own, which is only an interim role at the moment. You know, one thing that, you know, people may ask us about is, you know, who is running the WAY? You know, we have you know, people with a variety of backgrounds and experiences in the WAY, but I think we have room for more. You know, as we look to staff up, I'm definitely thinking about, you know, active outreach to communities that aren't as well represented in W3C work, because I think that's something that we really need to make connections with. We can start with our work, and I hope to see us doing that going forwards in W3C.
So that question, yeah, who is going to be leading WAY? Is there an incoming director position going to be open? Is this, Michael, you mentioned you're in an interim position. What are the plans stepping forward?
So I'm in an interim position, and the management really wants me to sort it out from there, I believe. But I'm working with Kevin. Kevin has more experience than me on some aspects of this role, but I feel that I'm bringing a lot of institutional memory, my long experience with W3C, and also a fair amount of strategic vision. So I think Kevin and I are able to work together on putting that out. We'll put together what that means. I don't know if we need a director, a centralized director. We're thinking about different models. I think that there are definitely aspects that Judy brought to the role that we need to keep, and we'll be looking for that. I think there are other aspects that we can cover ourselves.
And if I could just add to that, Judy, when I look across a long span of years, I'm not sure how that happened so fast, but I think the needs for the role that I've held, which was way director, have changed over the years. So when I came in, it was a question of kind of introducing the concept of, there's a lot of people with disabilities who want to be on the web, and it's really important to figure this out. There was a very long convincing stage, and then figuring out how to engage, figuring out how to get all the systems in place so that every standard that W3C develops gets reviewed for accessibility as well as internationalization and privacy and security and so forth before it can go out to the world. Those kinds of processes took a lot of energy, and sometimes people didn't want to hear about that. But that was a particular kind of energy, that convincing energy. And now there's still some of that needed, but a lot more of it is helping people, doing the explaining part in an authoritative way. People want to hear a clear message from W3C that aligns with the guidelines. And then also continuing to provide implementation guidance that wraps around our standards so that people know how to test. So the emphasis is shifting, but it's still a complex problem that needs good leadership. Complex program that needs good leadership.
Yes, speaking of, and part of that program, I think, is also the financial structure of the program. WAY has had a series of public grants in the US and in the EU. I recall also often the discussions of, does W3C even need WAY, or should the accessibility be parts of the different parts of W3C and be kind of more integrated? That's an evergreen question. Does it need a centralized WAY, or should accessibility be across the organization, non-decentralized? So what I'm getting at is there's a financial aspect, there is a structural aspect, and there is also just, human time, with less people doing more work, essentially. So, it still leaves me a bit, I'm not hearing I'm not understanding exactly what you plan to move forward in addressing these issues.
Happy to address that question.
Please go ahead.
So, and I don't know how familiar people are with this aspect of WAY, but really, since the Web Accessibility Initiative started in W3C, there seemed to be kind of an expectation that it would be partly self-funded or externally funded. And just for background, W3C itself is primarily a membership organization, so fee-based membership. But there seemed to be this expectation initially that WAY was kind of this extra thing, and you want to do accessibility. And so it's different in another way as well, which is, for the most part, W3C produces standards. But for accessibility, we always found that we needed an ecosystem along with the standards. We needed to be producing the standards. We needed to make sure that the other standards at W3C weren't breaking accessibility on their own, so we needed the review effort. We needed accessibility evaluation approaches. We needed tools that supported that. We needed to be looking at the new research and development coming along that was of emerging technologies that were about to land on the web and potentially break accessibility again. We needed an educational effort that was strongly aligned with like an authorized interpretation of the standards. And we also needed an effort on standards harmonization, because initially we had people around the world who were saying, oh, accessibility guidelines, that's a great idea. We'll make our own. And all of a sudden, anybody who was moving in and out of different jurisdictions found that they had contradictory guidelines they needed to implement too. So we had about 6 different areas of work, some of which went beyond W3C's regular business. So we continued to pursue external funding and got support, and I'm glad to say that's still the case. We're still getting good support in the US from Health and Human Services, National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, Rehabilitation and Research. From the Ford Foundation, also strong core support. From the European Commission, Judy, you helped get some really great projects. There are a series of them over the years. Also, there's a waste sponsor program. Currently, IBM and HP participate in that. We're very grateful for that. We welcome other people to ask about it. And then also some portion of W3C membership funding as well. What I've been saying in W3C increasingly over recent years is we need there to be a clearer path towards more normalization of accessibility funding from membership funds. In fact, accessibility is one of the biggest draws of W3C member organizations. And yet we're spending a lot of additional effort getting this external funding, which we're extremely grateful for because it helps us run this more comprehensive ecosystem. But I think we have a good diversified funding model, and I'm happy to be orienting my colleagues to that so that they can help carry that forward. But I believe it's very important that W3C try to do more to normalize and bring more member funding to the accessibility work in the future.
And I'll try to enter these questions from a slightly different perspective. I'd like to talk somewhat about, you started the question, does W3C need way? And I'd like to speak to that. So the Web Accessibility Initiative is one of several what we call horizontals in W3C. We look after a type of issue across all of the W3C specs, and we have others, internationalization, privacy, security. We could potentially have others as well. I have found in my work, we need the centralized expertise in those areas. It is good to have people who represent accessibility participating in the work. They can certainly raise issues. I have seen groups become more friendly to accessibility. I've seen the technologies incorporate it with less of a fuss over the years. In this particular room, there are people who could raise flags about a number of issues on a given technology, but still somebody's not in the room to raise a flag that could be very important. So I think that's one reason that we need to pull people in accessibility together so that we can share that information and make sure that we're providing comprehensive support. And let's see, the rest of the question was about funding and can we do more with less. Maybe I'll circle back to that. All I'll say for the moment, for my role, I don't have experience writing grants the way Judy does. So we don't know how the funding will work going forward, but it's one of the first things I want to be sorting out should we continue to write grants? Should we be doing other things? I agree with Judy about having our fair share of W3C funds as well. That's just something that we're going to have to be sorting out over the next year or two. Hopefully not in a way that distracts from the interesting work, though.
Let's switch gears and get a bit more technical. In my new role in the industry, one of my big concerns is what I feel is a bit of a diverging between acceleration of technologies. We're talking, across the hall about the metaverse and augmented reality, all these things. We're talking about, drones that go check who's on your front door, or fridges that will purchase the shopping for you, and these technologies are here, are real, but at the same time, it seems that it's taking longer and longer to develop the technical standards for good reasons, because there's more legacy, there's more, bigger community than there was in 1997, or, it's a different world. But how do we close that gap? How do we make accessibility standards still relevant and still useful to somebody trying to develop new technologies?
So for me, part of the answer to that is about appropriate architecture, in fact. One reason that W3C and web technologies have been successful, W3C follows a principle of universality, and accessibility falls into that. And many of the architectural decisions of how W3C technologies work are designed with that in mind. How can we design the technology so it will accommodate use cases that we haven't thought of, including accessibility use cases, but other ones as well. There's a lot of that still around, and it's something that we still have to push on. You know, there are, you know, every now and then architectures proposed that would hurt accessibility, and we have to speak to that. But I think we gain a lot from that. There is always going to be, or at least for now, there's going to be a slowness in accessibility propagation because a lot of accessibility happens, at least for some users, happens through assistive technologies, which are using accessibility APIs, which have to know about this newfangled widget that's being done. So there's going to be a bit of a delay. And we need to be there and on the job to work on that. The ARIA group is doing a lot of work to try to close that gap via testing as well as other things. And I think that we need to have a lot more of the accessibility user requirements type of guidance so that as W3C works on newer, different technologies, it at least has that general guidance that it can be looking at.
Plus one, as we say in the W3C community, I strongly feel that we have to learn how to judiciously and responsibly leverage the accelerator effects, the scalability of artificial intelligence and machine learning for the benefit of accessibility. It's important to do it well, but that's the way we can speed up and broaden the implementation.
Okay, good touch point. We know that accessibility has a lot of manual components, has a lot of complexity. But what can we do differently to improve on that? AI is maybe one aspect, but is that the only aspect? Is that the magic solution?
There's other approaches as well, and you know my interest in one of our, I think, missed opportunities, which is there's the web content accessibility guidelines, but there's two other guidelines that were there in companion roles with the web content accessibility guidelines. And we were really encouraged or kind of asked to shut those down, to some extent because of misunderstandings about the status at the time or misunderstandings about the benefits. But the authoring tool accessibility guidelines, and I'm seeing some people nodding in the room, which just really makes me happy because I'm thinking back, one of the first month or two, I had this role. NIDLR, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, try saying that fast, invited me to an in-house talk with Vint Cerf, and it was a dialogue with both of us, and I was like, Vint, what do you think is most important? He's like, authoring tool accessibility guidelines. So why is this so important? It does two things. One is, there's a component of ATAG, A-T-A-G, the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines, that's like, hey, the tools you use to produce web content have to work for people with disabilities because we want to be able to contribute to the web as well. And the second thing is, guess what? There's all these ways where you can support production of accessible content. So I'm still puzzled, let's say, why businesses haven't taken up on this more when they're looking at cost efficiencies, efficiencies of scale with production of accessible content. So we have a tag version that needs to be updated to align with WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 or 2.2, which is coming up. And it actually probably wouldn't be that much effort. But if people started saying, hey, I have an ATAG compliant tool, buy my tool, you'll be able to more efficiently create accessible websites, save the accessibility content, and so forth. I think that's an untapped potential. The user agent accessibility guidelines are also important. That looks at the rendering side, the browser side, media players, and so forth, and say, how can we better deliver the accessible content that has been created? But right now, web developers have to do more of the work than they probably should have to do. So the whole approach, I think, could be improved in the future, but to do that, WAY needs the space to open up activity, work activity, and those two things again. So that's one possibility. You're looking puzzled.
No, I'm just questioning. So is that the existing model going forward, more of it, or are
so
you, and maybe a question maybe more for Michael, you know, is there something different that we could do here?
It would need to be done differently. And so I'm not saying just go back to that. It would need to be done differently, and I'll allow my colleague to expand.
Okay. So I'll pick off from Shadi's original question and maybe circle back to what Judy was saying. You started with the word like manual accessibility, and I want to make sure we're clear what we're talking about. A lot of people refer to manual evaluation, which is when you're using an automated checker and then you have to check other things that it didn't check. But there's other aspects of manual accessibility as well. You know, when you're developing your website, there's things you got to do to make it accessible. And that's really just an education process. ATAG helps with that. Authoring tools and environments that support accessibility really help, and I've really seen the effect of that in the world. I'd say in the last 10 years, you can see that sort of, it's a basic level of accessibility when it doesn't involve full human intervention, but it does exist. But then we also need to keep in mind that accessibility is design as well as technology. We often design for how can we communicate to an assistive technology, or how can we change X aspect of a particular thing. But increasingly, accessibility requires personalization, partly because there are so many different types of problems that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. There's also so many different types of people that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And a lot of the technical questions there are really on how do we enable designers to do what they want to do and people to get personalization that they need as well. The whole world's moving that way, and I do think WCAG 3 is the thing that's trying to go in that direction. It's a very potentially boil the ocean project. We're trying to keep it a little more contained than that, but through that we hope to address new types of accessibility. And I will say that it's explicitly in scope to consider authoring tool and user agent requirements in WCAG 3, even though we don't currently know how that would look really at the moment.
So I think one last question, then I want to open up to the audience. Maybe there's more questions. I still have a whole lot. But they only scheduled us for 1 hour. One of the things that I think, or spend a lot of time thinking about, is the fact that people tend to equate accessibility with, or the other way around, they equate WCAG with the law with accessibility. Like they're all three interchangeable things, even though they are very different things. Accessibility is a very different thing than what a regulation requires, and very different than WCAG. And let me say it a little bit differently. I think Greg van der Heijden once said, we did very well on aligning on the technical standard, but maybe there's more we could do on aligning on the policy levels. We are starting to see, for example, in Europe, in the Web Accessibility Directive, live media is exempt, is removed as a requirement, because I guess it was thought maybe it's too hard or something. So we are starting to see fragmentation maybe on a policy level here. So, this is a bit of a broad question, but the idea is, what can WAY do here to help, to assist with the idea that there's a technical standard, there's a regulation, and there is the adoption of the technical standard in the regulation? What are the relationships here? How can WAY support this?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Let's see. Yeah, we've been talking a lot about the technical work of WAY, and I suppose that makes sense because that's mainly where my background has been. But we have a lot of other areas of work in WAY. We do a lot of outreach. We do a lot of support material development. We have an edX course. We put together a lot of materials. And I see us continuing to do that. I think making accessibility understandable is really important to us. And from some perspectives, it's the 80% of the work. You think you've written your guideline. Actually, you've just begun. I also want to talk about some changes that I've been seeing. One is to relate accessibility to universal design. We've probably been doing that for years and said there's some relationships. I really do see a greater awareness of, oh, if I add this feature here, more people in my audience are going to be able to use it or are going to find it friendly. And I'm really seeing cases where a universal design doesn't appear to have an accessibility mindset, but it's reaching accessibility. I think that has come through awareness over the years. It's come through much of the lobbying. Much of the legal requirements have helped drive that awareness. But I think, and that will need to continue to exist in certain areas. Governments have an obligation to reach all of their citizens, so they're going to need laws requiring at least themselves to be accessible. But that is helping to drive awareness, and I think that the whole world is moving along. What we need to do is really support that by helping people to make it understandable and usable. So next question is, how are we going to do that?
Still on this question, though, may I add two cautions in a way. One is that at the Web Accessibility Initiative at W3C, we've always had to remind ourselves and sometimes remind the community that we are not a policy shop. We're a technical shop. And so the challenge in front of us most directly is to develop guidelines and standards that work, that can be implemented, that can be taken up. I'm looking at Tim Cregan over here at the Access Board. But there's people around the world who are using these in different ways. I'm looking again at Irene. And it's so important that there are different policy frameworks with very different approaches sometimes and different timelines and so forth. So to some extent, I feel like our challenge has been, how do we write guidelines that can be taken up and used in those settings effectively and can evolve at a good speed and so forth, which brings us back to the question that it sounded like Michael wanted next. But I'm not sure how we are time-wise. Are you okay?
I would like to open up. We still have a few minutes, and there's a hand up in the middle of the room. Is there and one in the front as well, and one in the middle. There are lots of questions. Yeah. You can introduce yourself, please.
Sure. I'm Robert Ventris. I work at Virginia Tech. So I've had this question for a while, and I've asked it before in forums, and I've never quite gotten an answer that seems to satisfy me. And so I hoped you could help. And it's on it addresses some of what you were getting at with the pace of kind of standards development and making sure that user agents support standards and things like that. And that is that it seems to me in the standard kind of web development world, the way that progress has been made is that there's a standard, and then if a user agent doesn't support that standard, then there's a way to see if it's supported, programmatically, and create a polyfill that will make it so that it works until the user agents support it. And the fact that it doesn't seem like there is something like that I'm aware of for assistive technologies and user agents for accessibility-related things means that the developers and the designers need to put in so much effort to look at all the different combinations of things to see, is this going to work? And it's like, so we have to pick the lowest common denominator. and then there's not that progress. So I guess there's privacy things, and then I guess is that the main, and then I guess flexibility, you don't want to be too prescriptive.
So let me try to answer this question from somewhat of a technical perspective, and I'm not really speaking from a WCAG perspective. There may be other questions and answers around that. But in general, technology development at W3C, there's different paths to developing a standard, including do you write your standard and then implement it, or do you implement your technology and then say, let's standardize this? W3C has been moving more to the latter model in the past decade, and very often when something doesn't have a lot of implementation, they say go incubate it. That's the idea that things should be incubated with developers. In the case of accessibility, we use working groups to incubate, like ARIA, because the user agent developers are right there and we're a small group. But for larger things, it tends to go into other groups and then it bubbles up to W3C. To solve the issues of interoperability, there are projects like Can I Use, and we have an assistive technology version of that, which is the ARIA Assistive Technology Project, aria-at.w3.org. It's an attempt to collect test files and test results across the board for ATs. It's in an early phase, but it's a project that's going well. So that's a few steps we're taking to try to get better connection between standardization and implementation.
I think Dan Goldstein and John.
Yeah, should we take a question at the front? Hi, this is Dan. Just a sec, the microphone's coming.
Hi, this is Dan Goldstein. I felt a little uneasy hearing about Judy moving on, and it got me thinking as I was listening about what of the things we've accomplished in the last 20 years in web accessibility. Excuse me, I feel a little emotional. And additional accessibility would have been possible but for the work of Judy and her colleagues. And I feel like there should be thousands of people in this room saying thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan, for your kind words from someone who has had enormous impact on the field yourself, and thank you for that. Yeah.
Well, it's hard to ask the next question. I'm getting emotional now. So the impact that Judy has had and our three panelists up there have had internationally is tremendous. I saw Judy in Beijing educating, folks in Asia regarding accessibility, and the reach that you have all had is just tremendous. But at the same time, there's a lot of frustration in that, like Dan Goldstein just said, why is this room not packed? The frustration is this: is we talk so much about accessibility and let's put our money where our mouth is, right? Funding should not be an issue. And Shadi said, this isn't about, legal. W3C doesn't, create policies. It creates technical standards, like Judy said. But at the same time, 508 is harmonized with WCAG 2.0. And one of the most frequent questions I get is, what do we need to do to meet compliance? What do we need to do to not get sued? So y'all carry so much weight in this country as far as any sort of guidelines or standards, because it's just so muddied. And I guess the question I have is, what can we do? The attendees of M-Enabling and corporations, we have a lot of corporations attending here. What can we do to light a fire under these organizations to commit more and to move the needle more to support W3C and the work you're doing? Because it's just really frustrating to see that there's not more of a financial commitment toward this.
You took away my wrap-up question, but give that to Judy.
Yeah, thanks for your question, John, and for all the work that you do. And WAY is, above all, a very multi-stakeholder endeavor. We need everybody at the table, and we're fortunate to have many, many strong participants from so many parts of the community learning together. So industry, research, government, the disability community. I think I'm a little bit probably restricted on what I can say right now because I'm already taking up another role, but I will say, for me, for people with disabilities to engage in science and technology and expand that is one of my greatest hopes. We need to be at the table. Anybody in this room with a disability, anybody who has a close family member, knows the amount of creativity and innovation you have to do to get through a single day. And if you can apply that to the design and development of technology and share those insights and get in different roles, then you change the future. W3C needs that engagement, WAY needs that continued engagement, and we need people who can ask W3C the hard questions and remind them that there are people watching and people listening. And I think those are the components that change the future. So thank you for being part of that.
And on a really basic level, what we need is bodies. So every one of you, we need organizations to join the W3C and participate in the work. A lot of people are afraid that they don't have a place there, so they're tentative about joining. But we really need people to join, organizations to join, to lead with their feet. And we also need people who might have skills that you wouldn't expect. Like, in your organization, maybe your accessibility person wants to join some of our work. We need technical writers. We need people who are experts in policy, really expert in particular user groups, et cetera. That's a really concrete way that I think you all can help us.
Hi, Tim Cregan, U.S. Access Board. Since I got called out in the policy discussion, I figured I'd weigh in here. First of all, I would like to extend a warm thanks to Judy and to Shadi and to Michael for all the work that they've done in promoting accessibility standards and the whole concept of standardization throughout the world. This is a subject which is fairly complex, and it's not something that most people run into in their daily lives. So kudos to you for being able to explain something so complex. Secondly, with regard to the policy aspect, I work for the government. I'm here to help you. So in the context of implementing policy, what we did under the Section 508 standards was to try to agree on an agreed upon set of technical requirements that could be used to create accessible content. Now, you've heard today the many technical permutations of that, which are all valid and they're continuing. So, for example, the user agent accessibility guidelines, the authoring tool accessibility guidelines, all of that is important. And the impact they have on things that are commonly known, like standardized testing tools, all of that's significant. What I will say from a policy perspective is the policy approach is that less is more. The less you regulate, the better. And we have gotten that pushback consistently over the years. And part of the reason was because when we were doing the refresh of the 508 standards back in 2006, we were being told, guys, you have great standards for antique technology that nobody uses anymore. You're talking about telephones, when you really should be talking about the functions. And so we took that to heart. And so one of the things we were able to do with WCAG 2.0 was that was the standard that was not dependent on a particular technology. It wasn't HTML focused. So it has broad application. And that was several years worth of discussion with 82 different individuals in the room, okay? And that made its way through the rulemaking process, it got costed out, and it finally published. Okay, so going forward, the questions that have been raised about implementation and testing. Well, the rule as written didn't require for testing, and it didn't talk about implementation. And so those are things we've done separately in government. There's a group called the Accessibility Community of Practice, which I'm part of and other staff are, and we work on what we can do to implement accessibility across government. Separately, the testing idea, we're working on something called the ICT testing baseline. One of my colleagues, Kathy Eng, who many of you know,
Behind
who's
you.
here.
Behind you.
Behind you.
Oh, she's behind me. Okay, great. So she is working on this, and what it does is it gives everyone a baseline for how to evaluate the accessibility. So the point is, while policy is important, it's only one little aspect of the bigger problem. And I applaud you guys again for all the work you continue to do on this issue. So thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
And I cannot better these final words. So join me again. You know, many, many thanks to Judy for all your work, for all your leadership over so many.
Thank you for everything you all been doing.
And Michael, you have very big shoes to fill, but I'm absolutely confident. I've worked with you, and I'm really looking forward to the new perspectives you bring in.
Thank you, Shadi.
Thank you for interviewing us, Shadi.
Yeah.